It's wonderful to see so many dear friends here tonight. The Sierra Club sure makes a difference, and you're the ones that are making that difference. I just picked up the issue that came today in the mail, and Michael Bruin had this wonderful story about John Muir and how much he enjoyed the Indians that lived in the Yosemite, and he talked to them and understood their values, and he said they left little more imprint on the land than the squirrels. And so if you turn three more pages, you come to Kenneth Brower's article on wilderness. And I have on my shirt that I wore in '64 with the original patch that we designed for the Conservation Department by Charlie Gorman. And it's still, I'm missing a button down here. I've got it tucked in. But otherwise, this is the 50th year of the Wilderness Act. And at that time, I was commuting to Washington, D.C. on weekends and helping Stuart Vandenborg on some of the wilderness recommendations. I did the Lassen Volcano wilderness recommendations, although I'd never been there. I never had gone before, but that's how we had to work, lickety-split. One day we got a call from Governor Clement who said, "I want a master plan of Old Stone Fort in my office in 15 minutes. And the magic markers were sizzling, but the plan got there in time and we got our park. In fact, he was a courageous governor who went to the legislature and got $5 million to buy a dozen parks when the getting was good. We bought the Natchez Trace Park for $18 an acre. We bought the Stone Door for $50 an acre. And that's the sort of excitement that when you realize what you got, it's probably $1.05 million now if you were to appraise that. And for Radnor, my guess is $1 billion would not buy what we have here at Radnor Lake. And this is a present we gave ourselves. And Bill is absolutely right. Elsie Quarterman was not only involved in Friends of Radnor, but she was involved in the original group called the Middle Tennessee Conservancy, which we started in '64, and Doris Hendricks sitting on the back is in the amen corner because she's the only other one here that's still standing. And Louise Davis was our heroine, and Louise Davis inherited Major John Wesley Powell's pocket watch and took it out to the Grand Canyon where it's in the display, and I'm going to show that picture. So thank you, Doris. And tonight I want to talk a little bit about what I call, and Casey Dendoven best calls, the story behind the scenery. This was a series of wonderful picture stories about all the national parks. And in 1988, he wanted me to edit the first one on Tennessee state parks, and then a whole series on the rest of the 49 states, and also a series on the national forest. And we had a commissioner at that time from PVA, whose name I won't recall, who said, "Oh no, that'd be a conflict of interest." Well, this was a $100,000 free press run we were about to get. And so, although he wanted to hire me away from Tennessee to do that series, which was exciting, I declined. I also declined to be the state naturalist for Hawaii because we had 100 projects in Tennessee that needed completion. I was diverted to archaeology for 3 years and under duress, but we were able to sue TVA and slow down the Tellico Dam and to save some Indian sites, which are still there. And so I want to talk about the story behind the scenery and the time that remains. When you look at a map of the United States, even a National Geographic map, you can surely see the eastern side is where the Pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. And my Indian friends would say they would prefer the rock have landed on the Pilgrims. But anyway, most of the wild country is out to the west because it took us 100 years before we began to realize, hey, some of this stuff is better left like it is. And that's the wilderness idea. It was not only John Muir, but it was George Catlin in the 1820s who realized that the Indians were fast disappearing. He left his artist practice in New York and traveled all the way to the falls of the Missouri out with the Mandan and painted this picture, which hangs in the Capitol, I believe, in the state Secretary of State's office. And the Mandans were a unique people, and the Indians that were there were fast disappearing due to the diseases, smallpox, yellow fever, and other things that they were not able to withstand. They had no resistance. Catlin went all the way across this continent in the 1820s, and then he went to South America and went all the way up the Amazon to the Jivaros. And they never bothered him. They thought he was a holy man because he could make these images. And so he said, I love a people who do not live for the love of money. The Native American people are honest and generous, and he wanted to and did save their representations. Now, they fed off the buffalo. In Nashville, Native Americans recently complained, and Mark Tolley is here with Tennessee Ancient Sites, and we met with the mayor's assistant and said, you need to dig more under the Sounds baseball stadium. Governor McWhirter wouldn't allow any digging much under the original Baumall Park, so we missed an opportunity. That was the big salt attraction for 1,000 buffalo that lingered around the Baumall bottoms, which was, cane was 20 feet, canebrake 20 feet high. When my dad was a little boy, he was surrounded by wolves in West Tennessee with a canebrake like that. And they commenced to howl all around him. And the old man with him said, boy, this is no place for us to be. He was crawling and arthritic, but Daddy thought he meant the wolves were going to eat him. So he said his hair stood up. But anyway, this is how it was. And the buffalo, they came into this part of the eastern country very late, because if they had come 1,000 years before, the Indians would have eaten them all up. There was such a huge population. Nashville originally was a salt town which traded salt to the surrounding Indians. And they had these huge pots, 3 or 4 feet wide, and we found pieces of them just in digging a short distance under the Baumall. The bison that has, as you know, low cholesterol, an incredible animal that fattens on places where cows would starve to death, and we almost eliminated them. And now they're back. And Ted Turner's one of the good reasons. He's got a great herd. And of course, how we did that, we did it in about 40 years with these long rifles. We call them Kentucky rifles. They were made out of Montgomery Bell's iron, but they were very accurate and very deadly. Teddy Roosevelt was a remarkable conservative. He was a true conservative, a true conservationist. And he saw there was no difference. He realized that the corporations were ripping off forever the wood, the minerals, and he stopped that. He had the courage, and he had the diplomatic skills, and he had the cooperation of Congress, but not necessarily, because he set aside the first National Wildlife Refuge in 1903, a beautiful little Pelican Island down off the coast of Florida. It was one of the last places the brown pelicans were left. They'd shot them all out. All the way around Louisiana, the plume hunters were trading all those fancy feathers to Europe for big money. But that started the National Wildlife Refuges, which are now around 540 and growing. And they jumped about, I don't know how many million acres in Alaska. Teddy not only set aside the natural, he understood the cultural. And in 1905, he made Mesa Verde a national monument. Under an obscure clause of Congress, he was able to, he made the Grand Canyon a national monument when Congress wouldn't act to make it a park. And that scotched them. In fact, it made them mad. Now, Pelican Island was actually shut down by the Bush administration, and their staff laid off. And you can see they're standing room only. What a wonderful bird is a pelican. His beak holds more than his belly can. He can take in that beak enough food for a week, and I'll be damned if I know how the hell he can. And that's the unexpurgated version that the founder of the Tennessee Bird Club over there, George Mayfield and Albert Gagnier, and Dixon Merritt. Dixon Merritt was editor of the Lebanon Democrat, and he wrote that limerick, not Ogden Nash. So you can see the gulls are just hoping that he's going to drop at least one little fishy. Now, we all know what a travail the eagles have been through. The DDT was a terrible thing to pull on our national bird. When the mother sat down on the egg, instead of a chick, she got an omelet. The shells were too thin. And so Rachel Carson had the guts to blow the whistle on that. Although she died of cancer, she died as a martyr, and is really the mother of Earth Day and conservation and where we are. And the eagles are back. We've got 100 nests now across the state. And at Reelfoot, of course, we have a National Wildlife Refuge in the north end, a state park on the south end, and that park was established by the state. This was actually the first purchase in 1914. Reelfoot Lake was purchased by the state after the owner was going to drain it for a cotton patch. That's how close we came to losing it. And they went through all kind of legal proceedings, and finally the court said if the state wants it, they should buy it. So they bought it for about $32,000, and that was that. But it wasn't that, because it's since filled in a great deal. and it's always at risk. But what a wonderful place, created by the earthquake in 1811, and hopefully it'll be here a lot longer. Now, that was a CCC park set aside by act of the Tennessee State Park Commission in 1925. About 1935, Fall Creek Falls was found to be tax delinquent by Jim Hazard, our state forester, who put together many of our state forests from people during the Depression who couldn't pay their taxes. And of course, now we have 26,000 acres there and this incredible waterfall, the highest in eastern United States. And it just unfortunately had to have a zip line put in by somebody from Chattanooga. It's in the works now. You see Pepsi on the back of the park brochure, and it's one of our sponsors. And the bell is ringing in my mind as to how much commercialism do the parks deserve. We don't need a zip line up there, in my opinion, unless you want to go over one like this. Now, that's a real waterfall. Niagara, unfortunately, was such an attraction in this country that by the 1700s, it was already trashed and has been so far commercialized that they've been unable to make a national park of it. But it should be an international park, because this is the Canadian side and it's the best part. Maybe someday. I hope we will. Certainly, some of the first state parks were set aside by heroic acts. This is a fellow from Jacob Brower from Minnesota, and he said, I can't tell you how hard it was to make the Itasca into a state park, because it had virgin timber. It still does. And he had to appoint a woman as superintendent of the park, because the loggers would have shot any man that he appointed. And that was in 1891. So our parks have had an interesting role. In 1885, the New York State Constitution was amended that the Adirondacks should remain forever wild, and today they have about almost 6 million acres set aside in a green zone. And there are a lot of people and towns in there, but they learn to live like they do in England and keep it green and keep it beautiful. Now, in Tennessee, not only Fall Creek Falls, but Cedars of Lebanon was set aside during the Great Depression by another conservation president, this time Franklin Roosevelt, a Democrat. And people were out of work, and so they got land cheap, and they put people to work planting trees. They planted pine trees, which all died. They planted cedar trees, which all lived at Cedars. Same thing down at Shelby Forest in West Tennessee. They planted trees. It was a gullied piece of eroded land that was worthless, and now it's a 12, 15,000 acre park. And so it's come back. And this has a cedar glade in honor of Elsie Quarterman at a festival every year during the blooming time. It's usually in August, early August. Don't miss it this year, and go to the cedar glade. There's 1,000 acres that's set aside by the Division of Forestry for those rare flowers. Now, the first national forest purchases in the East were just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. You see, the federal lands that were left were open to anybody who would stake a mineral claim on them. But when Teddy Roosevelt came in, he said, whoa. And he hired a forester, and the forester said, whoa. And so they began to set aside lands. And in 1899, Dr. Chase Ambler in Asheville passed his hat, and they took up enough money to send a representative to D.C. and lobby for a 1 million acre forest near Asheville. That would have included Black Mountain, Mount Mitchell, and all Craggies and all of that, but they didn't get it. Instead, the story goes on. Just out back of this big shack near Asheville, North Carolina, the range of this estate of the Vanderbilts were all the way to Mount Pisgah in the distance, over 100,000 acres. And that's what became the cradle of forestry in the East, that purchase from the Vanderbilts, and that little tract that I just showed you, that sign, which was in honor of Dr. Ambler. And inside there, I snuck a little bitty pocket camera and took a couple of illegal photos. And this is Freddie Olmsted, and we have, raise your hand, Mr. Olmsted. We have an Olmsted here tonight who's a naturalist at where? Owl's Hill. So don't miss a hike with this guy. He'll hike your britches off, but he knows the woods. And Freddie Olmsted was the guy who designed Central Park in New York in the 1850s. And then he went out west. He was a friend of Lincoln. He got a boat chartered so they could help the poor wounded during the terrible Civil War battles. And then Lincoln appointed him to be the first commissioner of Yosemite and set aside Yosemite State Park during the Civil War in 1864. Olmsted, I'm sure, put an oar in the water on that one and got it done. And then over here is Gifford Pinchot. And Pinchot, of course, studied forestry in France and came over and said, we got to have a systematic forestry system. And Teddy Roosevelt agreed with him, and he became Teddy's right-hand man. And that's over a weekend, the Congress decided they would stop them from setting aside all this land. And the Speaker of the Senate said, now, next week we're going to stop you from doing that. So they set aside 16 million more acres during the weekend. And after that, Uncle Joe Cannon, the Speaker, said, not one damn cent for scenery will this Congress appropriate. And that's why we had to buy the Smokies, because they wouldn't appropriate any money for it. But the national forests that we have today have more trails, more camping, and more wilderness than any other federal agency. And they are really have to be watched over because the log barons are always after them. And the others who would like to mine minerals and so forth. And we have wilderness pending in our own Cherokee forest, and we'll talk more about that. Some of the finest scenery I've ever seen are in the National Forest. Mount Baker. Meg and I went out to Washington a few years ago, and Sheila and I believe, Sheila, you were on this trip to Mount Baker, and it's called Shuckstack by the Indians, and it's quite a shuckstack. But it's beautiful countryside. And yet you just go a short distance down the peninsula and you come to Olympic National Park, and you see what they've done to Olympic National Forest on the way to the virgin forest of the Hoe Grove. You look at these big stumps that are bigger than your Volkswagen, and you just realize there was a woman named Rosalie Edge who bought Hawk Mountain in Pennsylvania, and then she stopped the hunters from shooting the hawks. And then she heard what was happening in Olympic, and she called Franklin Delano Roosevelt and said, you got to get out there and see this mess. And he did. And he went out and he took a tour with the forest supervisor. And the president saw this stuff. And he said, I hope the damn SOB that did this is roasting in hell. This is a direct quote from the President of the United States. And the fellow beside him didn't say a word because he was the one that did it. But the result was the president immediately converted that to a national park, and most of the loggers out there, they were shocked. But the same thing happened in Tennessee. This was Natchez Trace, one of our national trails, Red Leaf Trail. You couldn't find it after they had a clear cut. And there's still a mentality that says in the forestry business that we got to cut out everything all at once, and that's about as stupid as it gets. You got to leave the young stuff to come on and replace it. Otherwise, you got to start over again, and then it sometimes just grows up in weeds. But finally, the paper companies that promoted this, which made it easier for them to make money off of it, got the pine beetle so bad they lost everything, and they had to sell off their land. But in the meantime, they impoverished the Cumberlands with its topsoil. Now, the forest resources in Tennessee are amazing. We have about 1 million acres, or more than that, almost 2 million acres, including the Cherokee, Nantahala, and Pisgah forests along the border of the states. And this is the Unicoi Gap, where the Cherahalla Parkway goes across into Carolina. And you're looking at billows of mountains all the way down to the Big Frog chain. And what we need in here is more wilderness to keep it in as pristine a condition as we can. And some of the Cherokee looks like this. And just south of the state line is a wilderness plaque in the Cohuttas of Georgia. And wilderness is a wonderful designation. Howard Zahniser wrote the act. People like John Saylor, a Republican from Pennsylvania, pushed it through. And 50 years ago, we started setting aside land where people go but don't remain, where they're untrammeled by people is the idea. And we need more of it. We need it right here in Tennessee. The first wilderness designated in our state was in 1975, a tiny little pocket up here in G Creek between Star Mountain and it's right on the edge of the Hiawassee River. And the park manager from the Smokies, Boyd Evison, was there. He's the first one that got the rangers out of their pickup trucks and made them walk. And they hated him for that, but at least we got a lot of what they call Boyd's boulders to block the roads off, so they had to walk. And this is a hardy band of wilderness advocates here. Now, that's just a short distance from the lower section of the John Muir Trail. Do you know Johnny walked through Tennessee in 1867? He discovered his first mountain stream, the Emory, or Obed. And he said, I lingered a long time in a grand rock dwelling and found a Dixonia and polypody and a little brown bird came down and sang sweetly to me. And that was the first mountain stream I ever beheld, according to Johnny. And then he went on down to the Hiawassee. And he said, there is a most impressive mountain river where the rock strata is upturned at right angles, causing the water to glance from right to left, and herein the wilderness sings with an eloquent voice. Well, the Appalachian Trail we have in the eastern part of our state happened because people like Stan Murray from Kingsport went up to D.C., and they were about to put the Pacific Crest Trail through. And I said, Stan, if you go up there and talk to him, you can get the AT added. And he did, and they did. And Stan kept the vision that was begun by Benton Mackay. Benton Mackay was the architect of the trail idea in the 1920s, and he was also the person where Harvey Broom was married in his parlor. Harvey Broom was a founder of the Wilderness Society. He was one of my mentors, and one of the best things he told me was, Mac, never let them know where their artillery is getting called from. Then you live to fight another battle. And so I've always tried to be out in the woods or out of town when the stuff hit the fan. And now, if you have a couple of socks that don't match and a dog that don't mind, you can take off on 6 months of the most delightful trip in your life from Georgia to Maine. Try it, you'll like it. Now, what they have done, though, is to build the parkway right down the crest of the Blue Ridge from Shenandoah. Both the Shenandoah and the Smokies were competing to become parks. And so Franklin Roosevelt said, let's do them both. Just put the dedication off from 1925 for the Smokies and make them both on 1940. And they did. And this goes all the way from Virginia down to you know where, Cherokee, North Carolina, and then it comes across to this huge parking lot we call Gatlinburg. Which has got some of the best neon guano and billboards that you can find, but it's also, of course, a good example of what ecotourism can do for a community. And this is, of course, Mount LeConte, named for Joe LeConte, the California geologist, and it's a wonderful mountain, still there. Paul Adams, when he was 17, led the party across the top, and they decided to make a park out of it. He knew the park better than anybody at that time. They have on the Carolina side this little historic village called Oconaluftee, and then just around the road is the Museum of the Cherokee Indian by the same name, and that wonderful display there, and that under these hills. And the Indians are making dugout canoes in the traditional way. They're baskets out of white oak and blowguns out of fishing cane, and it's wonderful to see how they got along. By the way, when Nashville was settled, the little adventure boat, a float boat, was paddled up the river. When they reenacted it, an 80-year-old man tagged along with his dugout boat. They were worried about him not making it. He was the one that paddled ahead and tied the rope so they could pull upstream. At Look Rock, these kids are learning they can get high on the mountain, not just high on drugs. And that's so important, because if we don't understand that, it'll be the end of all of us, won't it? Unless we can park and recreate and take a little time out. So let's don't wait until the end, because it's otherwise we'll be stuffed. So just give a hoot, and thank you very much. I think what we have to have, how do we find the right balance? We have to have advocates for wilderness and advocates for development, and we have to have a meeting of the minds, something Congress has forgotten how to do, apparently. But I think we can do it, and we have done it, and we must do it. And we have to have give and take, and we can't save everything, but we can't develop everything either, because we got to have enough natural world to keep natural things going for everybody. But I'm confident that Sierra Club is a strong voice for this, and I've also been criticized as, when Sheila and I were in Alaska, we had some drunks try to drive through our tent that night, and I snuck around behind them and goosed one and gave me a beer, and we were getting along fine until they found out I was a GD environmentalist, a Sierra Clubber, and then they were ready to go through the tent again. So we got to somehow get a balance just before that. Very good point.
Were they in
My daddy was a hunter and a good one, and a fisher. And when he went to the waters, he caught fish. When he went hunting, he killed ducks, and Mother made duck dressing. And he taught me when I was a boy to go in the woods and look at the grapevines and see which side the squirrels were using by where their toenails had knocked the bark off. And he could until a little bushy tail came down, then kaboom, we had squirrels and dumplings. I'm very lucky to have had parents like that.